Hello everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the CBME seminar. I'm Mathavi Senguttuvan, Research Associate and PhD candidate here at the Center for Biomedical Ethics, and I will be facilitating today's session. So we have colleagues from the center joining us in person today, and several more from various parts of the world dialing in through Zoom as well. And most importantly, we have our guest speaker, Professor Angus Dawson, who has kindly agreed to present on a very fascinating and topical subject: what role should sustainability play in bioethics? So to briefly introduce our speaker, Professor Dawson was until recently Professor of Bioethics and Director of Sydney Health Ethics at the University of Sydney, Australia. His research interests are in public health ethics, philosophical methods in bioethics, and ethical issues related to the creation and implementation of public health policy. He has a long-standing relationship with the center, and we are so glad to announce that he will be soon moving here to take up a position as Professor of Bioethics at the center. So now I hand over to Professor Dawson to take us through the presentation. Thank you so much, Prof, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today. It's a great pleasure to discuss these issues. So this is a quick slide on the kind of structure of what I want to talk about today. Most of the time, after a sort of brief introduction and description of the background, providing of context for this project, most of the time I'm going to, I'm afraid, do some kind of conceptual analysis and discussion, because I think that's really what's missing from the literature at the moment. But I will say a little bit about how these ideas apply to two issues in bioethics. And I'm very interested to hear from those of you that are working on other topics, how you might see sustainability applying to the issues you're interested in, or whether you think that it's irrelevant to discussions in bioethics. And I'll quickly at the end say a little bit about a couple of common objections that come up to, I think, the kind of account that I want to advocate for. So working on the concept of sustainability as part of a much bigger project that I'm engaged in, I see this as something that's going to last for a number of years and has already lasted for a number of years. And basically the way that I'm thinking about this is that I think we need to enrich the kind of values and arguments and language that we have within bioethics so that we can step away from what very often has become too, in my view, too narrow and sterile a series of debates about a limited kind of set of issues. And I put down there the 4 Ps, by which I mean the 4 principles. I'm kind of thinking about any account which has what I would think of as being a thin set of values, largely about harms, benefits, a little bit of justice, but mainly about autonomy. So that's something that I've been pushing back on really all through my career. And what I'm trying to do now is present more of a positive story, not just be critical. But I also wanted to highlight the fact that a lot of bioethics at the moment seems to have gone into a discussion about procedural values as a way. Again, I think there's a widespread dissatisfaction with where we are, and some people see the answer as being that we ought to go into thinking more about proceduralism and talking about legitimacy and so on. Those are important considerations, but I want to argue that they're not enough. And what I've been trying to do is to articulate and defend and think a little bit about a set of concepts that I call socially embedded concepts, things like solidarity, and suggest that they are a way for us to think about a more collective side of the kind of ethical language that we have. I'm also interested in sort of the way that various kinds of practice, medical health practice that we can see within related to bioethics, there might be some concepts there that we can take up and possibly reform. and use as the basis for this language. So that there I've got an example of harm minimization. That's a concept that I actually think is really problematic as a concept, but I really like the idea of the practice, which is behind the language of harm minimization. But that's another talk. And what I would suggest is that we can look to other kinds of areas of practice or academic activity, One Health, environmental ethics, and different moral traditions as well. So I think there's still a tendency for bioethics to be really dominated by this, what I was calling before, this thin set of values which emerged in the early 1970s, late 1960s in the US, and they have taken off across the world. And I'm particularly struck that when I go to other places in the world, when we're able to travel, I hear a version of these thin values given back to me, despite the fact that people are coming from deep cultural, religious, moral traditions. And I think there's an absence of those other kinds of values. So I'm really hopeful that in the future, there will be a way to broaden out how we think about what's relevant in terms of values. So today, of course, I'm talking about sustainability, but I just wanted to say a little bit as well about my understanding of bioethics. So I'm thinking about bioethics as a broad category that has a number of subdivisions within it. So medical ethics, clinical ethics, really, really important, but we should not use the term bioethics interchangeably with medical ethics and clinical ethics. There are these other areas, and for that reason, the values that are often discussed, for example, within medical ethics, clinical ethics, are not necessarily the appropriate ones when we look at other areas of bioethics. And the concept of sustainability, I will argue in a little while, is something that is relevant within clinical ethics, or at least some aspects of clinical ethics. But it's important that you see that I have this, again, that's probably a different talk, but maybe that's something that we might want to discuss later on. Okay, so probably too long an introduction there. I guess what I'm interested in is thinking about the fact that sustainability as a, let's call it a value for now, is something that you don't often see discussed or implemented in the bioethics literature. And I think that's very interesting. Why? So we have an explanatory issue in terms of trying to decide why that is the case. But I guess I'm today more interested in a question, which is, let's presume that it may be relevant in bioethics. So we need to then think about what are the key questions for us. And my talk today is trying to at least begin the discussion to answer some of these questions. So, you know, if we do accept that sustainability is a clear concept that is relevant to bioethics, then what actually follows from it? How does it, very importantly, how does it combine with other values? And one of the things that I want to push back on is a tendency for people to say, oh yes, sustainability is really important. And then you see it in policy documents when there's a listing of the values at the beginning of the document, sustainability gets added in, but it then never gets really talked about, and nobody, or the document itself doesn't explain how sustainability relates to those other kinds of values. So as Mathavi said in the introduction, one of my interests is in philosophical methods, and I hope that what I'm going to do today is to illustrate the use of philosophical methods and how they might be useful in terms of clarifying and suggesting how this kind of concept can be used in different arguments in bioethics. So I think I've already said that. Okay, so as I said before, most of the time today, I'm sorry about this, but I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about what we mean when we talk about sustainability. And I think it's vital that we try and have a clear idea of what we mean by a concept. Very often when we're talking about other concepts, justice, autonomy, etc., one of the problems is that there are a huge range of theories and they're contested concepts about exactly what we mean. I would argue that with sustainability, we have a different problem, which is that there has been too little discussion and clarification of what the concept is. So in a few seconds, I'll outline a few of the non-philosophical, non-bioethics ideas about sustainability. And again, I won't dwell too much upon them, but the point of doing that is to illustrate how vague the concept is, how we're at the beginnings of a discussion about what we mean by sustainability. So I would argue that then makes this a really exciting area to work on. So one of the first general things that I always think about whenever we're thinking about moral concepts is to ask this question about what kind of value something is. So an important thing in the background here is to answer the question, are we talking about sustainability as being something which we hold to be intrinsically valuable, that's valuable in itself, and that's a reason for us to direct our attention towards it, bringing about more of it, perhaps? So that's one question, is sustainability, or the thing that we call sustainability, is it valuable in itself, or is it valuable for other kinds of reasons? So it's valuable as a means to the other kinds of things that we hold are important, or are important ends to which we are orientated. And I mentioned this now before going into the different accounts of sustainability I'm going to outline today, partly because it's very often unclear what the authors of these particular accounts actually think about these kinds of issues. Now, why this is important is because we need to know what kind of value it is so that we can then think about how does it fit with other kinds of values. So again, this goes back to a sort of a general gripe of mine about a lot of policy documents, for example, where things are just added to a list and it's not really clear how they are supposed to interact with each other. Okay, so this is one of the most influential accounts of sustainability that you find in the literature. Almost everybody that writes on sustainability mentions this, and it's largely to do with this being an early formulation and in a document which has had global influence. But one thing you should notice is that, and in the different sections that I'm going to go through, I've underlined a particular phrase because you should notice that this isn't necessarily a definition of sustainability itself. It's an account of sustainable development. So we're already interested here in thinking about, is sustainability something which is a set of practices which are about a set of properties of activities? What I mean by that is that here we're talking about sustainable development. So we need an account of development that we're talking about. And the thought is that sustainability is some kind of description of presumably what we hold to be good development or successful development. So how could we actually abstract from this to step back and then say, okay, this is a definition of sustainable development. How do we get to sustainability? And tried to offer a kind of a version at the bottom of the slide here about what that might look like. But the other thing I wanted to call attention to here is notice the language of needs. So that's something that I think is interesting, because that's not always there in some of the discussions about sustainability. Okay, so another example from the literature, Farley and Smith argue that they do a classic move of many people to come along and say, oh, all this talk about sustainability, it's too vague. So what they argue for is what they call neo-sustainability, and they have their own account. And I would actually argue that this is a little bit too vague as well. So we have here suggestions at the bottom about these 3 rules. So what they're interested in here is not what I would think of as being an account of the concept of sustainability. They're interested in a set of substantive kind of claims about what we ought to be doing when we're thinking about all of our activities, perhaps as humans. And these rules, as they call them, are about that practice. They're not so much about the concept itself. The third kind of account here, again, slightly oddly, this author talks about 6 definitions of sustainability, but these aren't what I would think of as being definitions. These are sets of policies. And of course, they might be things that we want to argue in favor of, but a set of policies, a set of recommendations are not by themselves actually an account of a concept. So we're still waiting here to hear what sustainability actually is. There's an assumption that we gain a conceptual clarity by describing a set of policies, but the presumption is that we all share a similar view as to what those policies ought to be. And the other classic move that you see sometimes when thinking about concepts is to try and move away. So we had the idea before of moving to so-called neo-sustainability. The other way we could go is to think about, well, what is a lack of sustainability or unsustainable activities? Can we get anywhere by looking at that? So notice here that there's an account that's almost to do with the ability of thinking about a practice or an organism or an institution as being something that is self-regulating to ensure that it is actually going to persist into the future. So where does this leave us? I'd argue, of course, I haven't looked at every single concept of sustainability here, but these are just a few of the ones that you find in the literature. And where it leaves us, I would suggest, is with a bit of a mess, because if you ask me the question, what is sustainability? If you look in the literature, I don't think there's a clear answer. So if we want to move forward, I think a good place to start is by going back and noticing that in the Brundtland definition, sustainable development, sustainable there is an adjective. So it's telling us that there's a kind of idea about a property that might attach to development itself. And we can see that, I think, a lot in the way that we use the term sustainability when we're thinking about this in relation to bioethical issues. So talking about sustainable health systems, for example. So maybe let's assume for now that that's a useful way of thinking about this. Can we actually make a step forward by thinking about sustainability as being about this description of something in being of a particular kind? So there's lots of things to say here, but what I've tried to do is to pick out a few features sometimes you can see aspects of these within those definitions that I've just outlined. Sometimes this is my attempt to step back from this and just sort of make some suggestions about what might be important here. So the first aspect here is we have a just distribution. So we have some aspect to do with justice. We have particular kinds of goods. Now, I've called these depletable goods because if we had goods that just will never deplete, are kind of what I would call magic porridge pot goods, in reference to a children's story. I don't know whether everybody knows that sort of fairy story about a means of feeding a family and a community through having a magic porridge pot which never stops producing porridge. And so that's a non-depletable good. You know, it is always going to generate more and more porridge. But if we think about healthcare resources, for example, they are a depletable good. Thirdly, and really importantly, there is an aspect here in which there's an orientation towards well-being. So what I'm really hinting at here is that we ought to think about sustainability as being a property of various goods, and they are orientated, if we have a just distribution of those, they are orientated towards human flourishing or well-being. So that's the kind of end to which these are directed. So that goes back to my earlier kind of technical slide about intrinsic, extrinsic, and so on. And we also have to have a discussion about who are the relevant parties that are to have these goods distributed amongst. And importantly, when we think about sustainability, that distribution is not something that is just at a particular moment in time. We also have to think about the future. So there's a distribution over time as well as spatially. So I think that's just clarifying what I've already said. And that's the point about not just spatial, but also temporal. So this probably all seems very abstract. So let's move on and talk about a couple of examples. Now, I'm going to talk about antimicrobial resistance as my main example, and then I'll say something about health systems. I think in my abstract, I also mentioned climate change, but I decided that was just would be too much to try and cover. And we can always look at that in the discussion. But my thought is that the concept of sustainability, I think, is something that can be really useful when we start thinking about antimicrobial resistance. So there are various kinds of issues that come up here in relation to the use of certain kinds of drugs where resistance grows through the use of those. And it's important to see that this is just inevitable, but it is something that's accelerated due to various kind of human behaviors. Inappropriate uses of these drugs will actually deplete this as a resource for the future. And there are all kinds of things to say about why there are good reasons to try and preserve antimicrobials into the future. But today I'm going to focus on this idea about sustainability. And I'm going to try and argue that we have good reasons to see sustainability as linked up with this account of justice and well-being, seeing that as being important here. And the reason is that not all possible uses of these drugs are actually equal. So in at least some cases, we have a choice of using a drug now or preserving it for future use. And as human beings, we perhaps have a natural inclination to always think about using such a drug now, in the here and now, because we need it. But of course, some of those uses could actually turn out to be a poor choice, because it means that in the future, other kinds of choices can't be made. So we essentially sacrifice future, what might be viewed as even more important uses of such a drug, for uses which retrospectively we might look back on and think of as being quite trivial. So that's one example we can come back to in discussion. On the health system kind of side of things, I'm sure everybody interested in health systems would accept that the kinds of resources that we see as being important in relation to health systems are limited, and therefore they are depletable, and the choices that we make to expend resources on a particular kind of feature of the healthcare system can have consequences for the longer term sustainability of the system. So I say a little bit about what that might mean, but again, this is perhaps something that we can come back to in the discussion. One thing I do mention here is thinking about how some of these issues might relate to more global health issues. So thinking about the obligations that we might have to provide the various kind of basics. WHO's focus on universal health coverage, for example, might be a means of trying to think about sustainability within health systems. Again, notice how some of these elements here relate to thinking about notions to do with justice. Okay, so going back to the kind of the sketch of the kind of concept of sustainability, hopefully you can see how those two examples are things that we could talk about in relation to these various elements that I was picking out before. Okay, so I'm just going to talk quickly about two possible objections to this, and this is particularly thinking about sustainability and this claim that we are interested in particular kinds of goods and projecting into the future and ensuring that those in the future have access to these particular goods. There's a claim of justice which future people potentially have upon us, and part of that argument is appealing to this notion of perhaps an obligation to ensure that various goods are sustained into the future. Now, one of the objections that sometimes comes up is that a lot of traditional economics tends to discount various kinds of goods and harms that are going to occur in the future. So there'll be sometimes a formal discount rate that's actually applied. And what this tends to do is to minimize any kind of claim that future generations might have upon us. So, for example, the O'Neill report, which is a UK-based look at some of the economics to do with AMR, makes no mention whatsoever of future generations. And it's important that the chair of that body that produced that particular document is himself an economist. So I think there's a set of assumptions here which are very common in economics, but those assumptions are things that can be challenged. And I see no reason why we ought to just build an acceptance of those a priori into the way that we think about these kinds of issues. And the second issue, probably already come up with some of you who work on these kinds of issues, is a challenge that comes from the fans of Derek Parfit. I see this a lot in reproductive ethics discussions, and it's the so-called non-identity problem. And the thought here is that the choices that we make in terms of the expenditure of resources are, of course, going to have an impact upon which particular individuals actually come into existence. So if, for example, we choose to put resources into fertility services, then that might actually create certain kinds of individuals that otherwise would not exist. So there's no doubt lots to say about this, but there is a response which I think is appropriate when we're thinking about things at the level of organizations or systems and so on, which is that obligations that attach to this notion of sustainability relate to not individual possible future persons, but to a whole class of whoever it is that actually exists in the future. So we can't, of course, identify which particular individuals will have a need for a particular antibiotic in 100 years' time, but we do know that there will be some people, X, Y, and Z, who will have that requirement. And if we've already used up that resource through inappropriate prioritization, perhaps just letting the rich use these kinds of resources and expend them on trying to produce the fastest grown animals to maximize profits, for example, over thinking about what the health implications might be, then that is a claim of justice that can be made even if we can't actually identify particular individuals. So my conclusions are that there's a lot of work to be done when we think about the concept of sustainability. We're just at the beginnings of that work, but I think there's a really fruitful opportunity to think about the concept, how it might be used in different arguments in bioethics. I've only given 2 examples here, but there's a lot of work to be done as well about the concept itself. And I would draw a contrast again with these kinds of concepts like autonomy or justice, where huge amount of work has been done within bioethics, clarifying what these concepts are, talking a little bit about how they fit with other kinds of concepts, and trying to provide accounts which are very often competing against each other for what a particular concept actually means. So I would argue that my kind of provisional conclusion in relation to sustainability is to suggest that we ought to be focused upon these in relation to a particular kind of good. So these depletable goods that may have implications for the future, and that's why we ought to be thinking about not just distributions at a particular moment in time, but also thinking about the future. So this then leads on to a set of issues for theories of justice as well. So would a just allocation of various depletable goods mean that we would have to take into account that future orientation? And clearly that has implications for things like climate change as well. So perhaps I'll stop there and then see whether you have any questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. That was very fascinating and such a foundational seminar on the topic. So, I mean, maybe before going forward with questions from the audience, I would like to take the opportunity to ask you a question myself. Would you suggest that sustainability is relevant in all areas of bioethics or bioethical issues? And I ask this question particularly from how you define it, or rather, how would you define a depletable good in bioethics per se? And that's where I'm sort of confused in this discussion. So maybe you could give some clarification on that.
Yes. So I don't think sustainability is something that we ought to just add to our list, as I said a couple of times. And therefore, it's not always going to be relevant to every discussion, every argument, every paper in bioethics. But it is there very often in the background. So if we're talking about an issue in clinical ethics, for example, ideas about sustainability for health systems is going to be there. And just like issues to do with justice are very often going to be there. So we might choose, for the purposes of having a focus on a paper which can fit the word limit for a particular journal or something, which means that we set various things aside. And I think that's fine, but we just need to be aware that something like sustainability is actually there in the background a lot more than perhaps we might think. And I guess my starting point is thinking about the relative absence of sustainability in discussions in bioethics. So I think I'm trying here to do some conceptual work in terms of what do we mean by the concept. I haven't given a final kind of account at all. But I'm really interested in, even if people are less interested in that question, a more philosophical question, at least they might be able to see how something like sustainability is more relevant than you might think if you just looked at the literature of bioethics.
Thank you so much for that. So maybe we'll move on to the audience questions. We already have so many coming in. Do we have any questions from the in-person audience that we can take first? Okay, we have Prof. Benjamin with us.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I would like to get your opinion on a question that I struggle with, and that is the curious but unavoidable logic that when we speak of intergenerational justice, the speaker must imagine the addressee who does not exist and must imagine the best interests of future persons who do not exist. And we can imagine presently that we won't always get it right. That is to say, we are fallible. And so the question is, can you imagine some ways that the present generation might be able to reassure itself that in imagining necessarily the future addressee, that we can control for some of the errors that are possible in imagining a future generation and their needs and their concept of justice? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think when we, I think maybe I had this on a slide, or maybe I took it off when I was trying to cut down on my slides. But I think it's important that when we think about the future, we don't just assume that every single individual is to be accorded the same kinds of value. This isn't a claim about universalization related to the here and the now and into the future. A certain kind of prioritization of the needs that currently exists is appropriate. So this comes back to, again, thinking about what kind of value is sustainability. Maybe it might be a kind of constraint rather than something that is intrinsically valuable. So I'm kind of, in the background here is a concern that I have about the way that sometimes the enthusiasts for the idea of sustainability talk as if we ought to give always equal kind of weighting to everybody in an hopefully infinite future or near infinite future, certainly a lengthy future before the Earth is consumed by the exploding sun, or we all kill ourselves off with terrible climate change or whatever it might be. So I think that's a relevant consideration, and that's part of the justification for the economists discounting claims. So basically, they're going to argue that we account for the kinds of additional weighting that we might give for presently existing kind of needs, concerns, or persons now by using that kind of mechanism. So again, I think there's a lot to be said about how exactly the kind of distribution into the future might actually go. But I think a useful way to think about this is thinking about it, as I said, as a constraint upon the kinds of uses that we might have. So going to AMR, certain sets of drugs, we shouldn't be just using these in a way that is perhaps driven more by profit rather than thinking about the kind of, we need to prioritize, as it were, protecting future health benefits, even though that has implications for other kind of aspects of our lives at the moment. For example, people could actually reduce their meat consumption or indeed not eat meat at all.
To a question from the chat. So Jan L.D. says, a thought-provoking seminar. I would just like to ask regarding antimicrobial resistance and sustainability. What do you think is the best way we move forward regarding AMR? Do you see us restricting the use of antibiotics in the future, particularly limiting the use of antibiotics to individuals with severe infections?
Yes, I think that would be a good way to go. So the kind of stewardship that has been encouraged at the global level by different UN organizations, I think is a really important kind of first step. So there's some good work already going on in relation to this. And I think that can be used as an example of exactly this thing that I was just talking about, this idea of a constraint upon present uses for the sake of preservation for the future. So if we have a good that is not depleting, then we don't need to worry about this. But the thought is that where we have something which is actually not self-sustaining, as it were, then we need to think about what that actually means. And I've argued that we have good reason to see this as being a constraint upon our present uses for the sake of preserving it into the future.
I think there's also a follow-up question to whether that is ethical or not.
Sorry, what do you mean?
Maybe the person who asked the question can ask it themselves.
Hello, good day, Dr. Dawson.
Hi.
But limiting the use of antibiotics to severe infections, is that ethical? I mean, it might be sustainable, but what are your comments on its, if it's ethical? Thank you.
So I think it can be defended, particularly given the account of sustainability that I was arguing for. I guess the first point is that I'm pointing out that sustainability itself is a normative concept. It's not a trivial descriptive concept. There are kind of claims in all of the accounts that have substantive kind of claims. But the two kind of key related concepts, and I'm suggesting that sustainability is a means for depletable goods that links up claims of justice and an orientation towards improved well-being, and a prioritization of the use of antibiotics for particular circumstances, which are perhaps the saving of lives, rather than some of the other potential uses, is something that can be justified through making kind of ethical arguments. Of course, people can push back on that and they will have alternative views, but that's the kind of discussion that I think we need to have about sustainability. But I think most people would want to prioritize the saving of a child's life who otherwise may die over the profits to a particular farmer that comes from more rapid meat production. So maybe that's more contentious than I think, but that's the kind of discussion that we need to have. I think the assumption is, in all the discussions about AMR, that is a reasonable assumption. There is a kind of optimism that you sometimes come across in relation to AMR and more generally, which is another reason to prioritize the use now, is that we'll have some new drugs in the future. But you know, I'm personally more skeptical about just assuming that goods will come into existence in the future. They may, but I think it's worth thinking through what do we do with the resources that we have now, and what are the choices that we make about how we use them now, and should we think about preserving those goods as long as possible because of the potential benefits that there might be in the future. And so that necessarily promotes an idea about prioritization, which is, broadly speaking, a welfarist one when we're thinking about these kinds of resources. But it has egalitarian elements, because it's basically saying that there is some sense in which lives are things that are to be considered equally, though there will be some kind of natural prioritization of existing needs over future needs. That's why I describe this as being a constraint rather than some kind of absolute claim. Again, it's very interesting how some people talk about sustainability. I think some people just assume that it's intrinsically valuable. I don't think it is. And they also assume that any kind of claim about sustainability, or some people seem to think any claim about ethics at all, is going to be something which is universal and general and so on. And this is probably going to take us too far away from the topic, but that's not how I think about ethics at all, given my kind of meta-ethical and normative moral theoretical commitments.
Maybe I can read out Murali's question first. He has 3 questions for us. Doesn't the fact that the world over has endorsed the rather thin 4-piece suggest that it is the product of an overlapping consensus of perhaps reasonable views?
Okay, interesting question. So we'd have to do a long kind of analysis of the history and I think there's an interesting question here about whether the 4Ps approach, as I was dismissively calling it, is something which is because there is this kind of consensus that this is the way to go, or that it's a feature of the cultural hegemony of the US and the way that this kind of gets taken up around the world. We can have a lot of debate about that. There are all kinds of problems about the 4 principles, but the elements that I think are important and are going to be relevant everywhere in the world are this idea about harms and benefits, idea about justice. Liberty, autonomy is something which I have more of a question mark about, because I think it is less apparent that is a kind of dominant value. And I think there's an interesting set of issues about whether that again is something that is intrinsically valuable or not. But it's certainly possible that there's an overlapping consensus here. But I think in terms of moral theory, in terms of metaethics, I think there are significant problems with the 4 principles, which we probably shouldn't go into today. But I'd be really interested in talking about this in the future. Again, I've written a little bit about the 4 principles and the way that they then get used by the advocates of 4 principles, which I've argued with a colleague is actually incompatible with the kind of normative claims that they themselves make about the theory. So there's supposed to be 4 equal prima facie obligations, but then they tend to prioritize one over all the others, namely autonomy. So Rahn and Gillen, for example, calls this first among equals.
A couple of follow-up questions as well. Isn't asking whether sustainability is an intrinsic or extrinsic value before working out what it is getting things backwards?
Yeah, I mean, why I put that slide in where I did is because whenever we have a particular concept that we're interested in, I think there are a set of questions that we can ask. So this is partly a methodological point in terms of before looking at the definitions, I think it's worth asking this general question. This is one of the issues that we have to answer in our account of the concept of sustainability. So we need to have a clear concept so that then we can answer the question about what role that concept might then play in bioethics by thinking about how it interacts with those other kinds of values. So just turning the 4 principles, to go back to that example, and sort of saying, well, we need to have a 5th principle, which is sustainability, and we just stick it onto the list. I think that's a real problem, in that what I was trying to suggest is that if we think about sustainability in the way that I've just been arguing, it acts as a constraint, but is very strongly related to justice and also well-being. So it isn't something that we should just see as being a 5th principle in the 4 Ps kind of approach. And this is part of the problem that I have with a lot of bioethics, and that kind of long introduction that I had at the start was partly trying to make out the case that I think it's time to think critically about reinvigorating the language that we use within bioethics. So I want to say, this is not the final word by any means on sustainability. That hasn't been my aim today. The aim is just to say there are good reasons to think that sustainability is an issue for many questions that we face in bioethics. How does that, let's call it a value, add into the discussions? What is its appropriate place in the kinds of values, principles, rights, whatever your favorite language is? Where does it actually fit? So nothing is settled. I haven't by any means done the work to kind of do that. It's more a question of raising the issue, what is sustainability and where does it fit in bioethics? The kind of claim that I would want to defend, and I've been trying to defend today, is that sustainability is relevant in at least some bioethical issues.
So from the chat, we also have Mikey's question. Your account of sustainability looked to me to provide a temporally sensitized utilitarian account of distributive justice. One implication of this would be that it would be conceptually incoherent to examine the sustainable distribution of human misery or the sustainable distribution of freedoms on non-welfarist grounds. Is this a reasonable
I I always try in what I do to remain as neutral as possible in relation to kind of normative theories. So I don't like talking about utilitarianism, because I think there's a tendency for people to interpret that according to their understanding of somebody like Bentham. So I would accept that the characterization that I've given is broadly consequentialist rather than utilitarian for that reason. But it's consequentialist in the way that virtue ethics is also consequentialist, in that there's an orientation there towards human flourishing as the ultimate end. And I certainly think that my sympathies are more kind of in that direction. Again, probably taking us too far away from discussion of sustainability, but there are both normative, theoretical, and meta-ethical reasons for preferring some kind of neutrality here in terms of the claims that are being made. So I see no reason why you couldn't have a deontological account that actually took sustainability seriously. And indeed, in the more politics kind of literature, where there's been some discussion of so-called environmental justice, you see what looks like a kind of deontological account. So talking about, we'd have to unpack what we meant by distributive justice as well. I'm somebody who's not happy either with the place that a lot of political philosophy's got to in its kind of post-Rawlsian consensus. I think it's too limited and too narrow, and that's how you end up with a lot of these discussions about things like legitimacy, is because there's this kind of feeling that we can't actually get anywhere with our accounts of justice. But clearly there's a lot of work to be done here about what an appropriate account of justice would be. Again, I'm seeking to just make what I take to be a relatively modest claim, which is that considerations for those in the future is something to take into account. And perhaps that acts as a constraint upon our actions now. That's the example that I focused on here was AMR, but it's something that I think we could also think about in relation to climate change.
Maybe we can take that question from Owen now.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'm very much on board with this central idea that, concerns of distributive justice across generations is really important in a number of bioethical debates, if not all, then a lot more than maybe are currently considered. But I guess I wanted to maybe put pressure on the linking of that idea with the concept of sustainability, right? And you're saying this is the core overlapping aspect of sustainability when we talk about this. And I guess my sense is actually that the notion of sustainability is broader than that. And I guess I'll try to express why. Because your flag of what is really important about sustainability seems to focus successfully on just distribution. And I guess my impression would be that the talk about sustainability often makes no direct reference to distribution. I'll put it in quote in the chat here. This is from the Bioethics Advisory Committee of Singapore. It's a research ethics document, and they talk about sustainability in research. They say sustainable in the sense that it should not jeopardize or prejudice the welfare of later generations, and use the example of harms caused by human genome. And this is clearly, because there's a flag here about future generations matter and are ethically relevant. I think that is really, in my sense, the core. But it's not, you could twist, is it really about distribution? Not really. You could say, well, you can see harms from research as a good that could be distributed, but that seems a bit of a stretch. It seems instead, this is a primarily distribution of, a primary concern about the scope of welfare, the scope of who matters and who should count in our considerations of risks and benefits of research, for example. And so, yeah, so I guess my overall sense would be, isn't it this cross-generational consideration, right? We should take into account individuals across generations in our moral calculus that is the core flag of of sustainability rather than just distribution of goods that have some welfare impact. Okay, over.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Owen. Maybe this is a case of I came into thinking about sustainability a little bit already thinking about AMR, and that's like colored my thinking in relation to the concept itself. And I guess this is why it's interesting to think about how this concept might be useful and play out in different kinds of arguments, different kinds of examples across the whole broad range of issues in bioethics. I take your point that this particular use doesn't talk about some of the aspects that I was focusing on, but I guess my pushback here would be to go to thinking a little bit about what we're doing when we're formulating accounts of concepts. So I'm not an advocate here for some kind of necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a concept. I'm actually a big fan of later Wittgenstein and thinking about how we have these kind of grouped ideas around the language that we use, the uses that we have for particular concepts. So it might be that we use the concept of sustainability in a number of different ways, and perhaps I've overemphasized one particular use, and you're pushing at a slightly different use. So it might be that there's again, using Wittgensteinian language, a family resemblance kind of idea here, and what is at the core, what is at the margins of the appropriate use of the concept itself. I'm not saying that the kind of elements that I was outlining, the numbered conditions, as it were, they're not supposed to be necessary and sufficient conditions. So we might be able to reach out and include other kinds of elements. Maybe they're secondary, maybe it's key. But I think you're right that sustainability, some of the definitions I looked at had this kind of more almost organist kind of idea about the sustainability of the thing itself. And it looks as though that's something which is an element to that, the definition or the kind of example that you posted in the chat. So I have to think a little bit more about how that actually goes. It might be that certain kinds of uses of the term are going to be slightly different from others, and maybe I've overemphasized one particular aspect because of the kind of examples that I'm interested in. But I presume that you would take the more general point, which is that you're here providing other examples where the idea of sustainability seems to be in play, and that feeds into my overall general argument, which is it seems a little bit surprising that there isn't more discussion of these kinds of ideas within bioethics.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Prof. So I think the next question we're going to take is from the in-person audience here. I believe the next one was Markus. Yes?
Okay. Is the microphone on? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks very much for the conceptual clarification here. I completely agree with you that sustainability is underemphasized, not just in bioethics, but probably in moral philosophy more generally. Just a brief question I have about your initial understanding of the concept of sustainability. I think on the first slide where you discussed that, you ask whether it is an ideal, a value as a kind of ideal. And my well, if it is an ideal, so the way I would understand an ideal is it's something we can approach, but we can never reach. But sustainability actually seems to be, to me, to be something else, which is something that once we allocate sufficient resources to it, we can achieve it. So it is in a sense a threshold to value. So I just want to ask, like on which sides you would stand? Would you consider sustainability to be an ideal value in a sense that we can never reach it, or something that is a threshold and that we can achieve once we allocate sufficient resources to it? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I guess what I was trying to do there was, again, raise this general methodological point about the way that we ought to discuss different kinds of ethical concepts. And one key question is this means and ends kind of issue, intrinsic, extrinsic kind of issue. They're slightly different questions, but they're often confused, and I think ultimately they are actually related. So why I included the language of ideal was more as this idea of an end that we are perhaps directed towards because we see it as being something that is maybe intrinsically valuable. And so it then ends up being, the best example would be something like flourishing, well-being, and so on. Many different kind of normative moral theories are going to have that as an aspiration, as something to which we ought to direct ourselves, and the interplay between other kinds of values is arranged in a particular way to try and bring us as close as possible towards that particular end, the ultimate end. So the question here is sustainability that kind of end? I would argue it's not. And it's about the arrangement of those other kinds of things. It's very important, but it is not an ultimate kind of end. And that's the sense in which I might be accused of being consequentialist in terms of the way that I am choosing to categorize sustainability is amongst the different kinds of values which we have to think about the arrangement of those. And that's where the justice aspect comes in, and how that orientates towards the ultimate kind of goal, as it were. So sustainability, I think many people, when they're talking about it, they use it as if it was an end in itself, intrinsically valuable, potentially as an ideal to which we ought to orientate ourselves. And I think that's to misplace the value. But it's, really what I'm seeking to do here is to encourage more discussion of these kinds of ideas. And maybe in the future, I might be convinced that I'm wrong. But my present view of these things is that sustainability itself is not something which is intrinsically valuable. It's about this relationship between other kinds of complex goods and values, and the way that we might evaluate those is not in terms of sustainability, but in terms of human flourishing, well-being, whatever language we might choose to use, given our meta-ethical and normative moral commitments.
So we have quite a few questions in the chat, so maybe we can take one of those. Amy asks, what is the effect of commercialization in the healthcare arena that would affect sustainability in the future?
Yeah, so this is a very good question to think about, I think, because of that second example, which I didn't spend so much time on, thinking about healthcare systems. The kind of healthcare system you have is going to be integrated into discussions about sustainability. So we get into complicated issues here, which are beyond my expertise about how we take into account various kind of economic considerations, different kinds of motivations for people, and so on. But I take it it's a relevant question what kind of healthcare system we might have within a particular nation state. And then there's also the global aspect of this in terms of what obligations might there be to support at least basic kind of healthcare infrastructure in other parts of the world. Simplifying slightly for today and thinking about a nation state, what the relevant combination between private and public provision actually is something which is going to be relevant to the kind of account of sustainability that I've been gesturing towards here, one that is concerned about thinking about a just distribution. So an account of a healthcare system or a health system more broadly that chooses not to think about sustainability, as I would argue many health systems actually don't, means that you're going to be prioritizing the people here and now, and perhaps politicians will have a tendency to do that as well because of the need to get people to vote for them. There's a danger of too much short-term thinking. So whether we're talking about AMR or we're talking about healthcare system, the really useful practical consideration, I think, to do with sustainability is the way that it orientates us to longer term considerations, not just to think about the here and now. So again, a concern that I have about a lot of discussions in political philosophy at the moment is that the question of resources is about how do we distribute resources here at this particular temporal moment? Do we give more to public provision to try and make up for those who don't have the resources themselves, or to address disadvantage in society, etc., rather than thinking about the choices that we make now also have implications for the future? And some kind of resources, of course, are going to be in a healthcare system, given taxation and so on, or whether it's paid through private funding, there will be a resourcing of these issues into the future. But is that sustainable in terms of are particular choices going to get made that mean that we prioritize one kind of service over another? So an area of activity which I spent most of my academic career talking about, public health, is something that people have a new understanding of what that means, given our pandemic situation over the last couple of years. But broadly speaking, public health, it's too easy for governments and the public to neglect something like public health relative to various kinds of aspects of clinical care, because the clinical demands seem to be more immediate. But it might be that by shifting resourcing into more public provision, public health provision, you actually have longer term benefits from using those resources in that particular context. And there's a whole kind of narrative here about new technologies and how they drive economies and so on. Very important issue, of course, in Singapore. But and it's also something that we see in the bioethics literature. You know, this kind of idea, a tendency to focus, perhaps, in my view, too much upon responding to the latest technology that comes along, and you kind of get, broadly speaking, techno enthusiasts in the literature, and then techno conservatives, and there's again too much kind of separation into those groups. You already know, once you know particular individuals, what it is that they're going to say about a particular kind of new technology that comes along, which can get a bit frustrating and a little bit dull, to be honest.
Since as we are speaking about sustainability, what is the role of sustainability and bioethics, especially in the warfare, especially during medical crisis in the warfare when people suffer, and how sustainability plays in there? And second question is, as you have shown the slide before, why we cannot interchange bioethics and medical ethics? These are my two questions. And thank you so much.
Oh, okay. On warfare, I think thinking about sustainability in that area is a really interesting question. So there's an area that we might call military medical ethics, which I think is really interesting. It's not an area that I've spent a lot of time reading about and thinking about, but my superficial response is to say that there might be particular considerations to do with sustainability in that kind of context. So, for example, within a military setting, there might be a prioritization when it comes to the triage of casualties that tends to orientate itself, you know, if there's an immediate attack going on upon a particular place, there might be a prioritizing of those with relatively trivial wounds that can be quickly addressed so that those military personnel can then return to frontline duty, for example. So sustainability in that context has a particular kind of meaning. And a bit like Owen's example, I think if we were interested in trying to formulate an account of the concept of sustainability, which was more like a traditional listing of the necessary and sufficient conditions for such a concept, which is something I'm not trying to do here, then it might be really important to ensure that those kinds of uses of sustainability are things that we would have to take into account in the formulation of our concept. But I'm quite happy to say that that kind of use of the notion of sustainability is something which is probably less central to the main kind of use of sustainability, but it is going to be something important and relevant. On the case of how we define bioethics, so I think this is a really interesting issue that goes right back to the original kind of use of the term, at least in common language. So there are various kinds of claims that the term was used in Germany in the 1920s, but most people see it as being something that emerged in the very late 1960s, early 1970s. And there was a dispute at the time about who actually coined the term, again, ignoring other kind of historical claims that might be made. Broadly speaking, there were two camps. So there's the Potter camp. He was somebody who was very interested in this much broader account of bioethics, thinking about prevention. He was an oncologist. He was interested in the environmental considerations and so on. And there was another account of bioethics, which was more based around Georgetown University, that linked up with the four principles. And that tended to just use the term bioethics interchangeably with medical ethics. The reason not to just go with thinking about the two as interchangeable is, again, partly conceptual, in that I want to defend the idea that bioethics is about the ethical issues that are related to the whole of health, not just medicine. So they're going to include nursing, public health, psychiatry, neuroethics, etc., etc. You know, there's a whole range of areas of health, but bioethics also includes various kinds of environmental considerations, various kind of issues related to the life sciences. So then, as with Potter's formulation of the concept of bioethics, it's reaching out towards One Health kind of considerations, thinking about ecology, thinking about the human beings' place within the environment and how there's an interactive kind of process. So lots of discussion about this in relation to One Health and how human beings relate to the environment and to animals. Again, just thinking about infectious disease and pandemics, you know, we can clearly see how this is important, and the expectation that contagious disease and pandemics might actually increase in the future as we, as human beings, encroach upon certain kinds of environmental reservoirs for disease within particular species that we then come into contact with, and then there's a leap into humans, etc., etc. So I know some people like to think about bioethics as being interchangeable with medical ethics. Maybe there's an argument for saying medical ethics is at the core of bioethics. Personally, I don't think that. I think there's a potential problem if we choose to see things in that way, because a lot of the thinking about medical ethics might be going back to long traditions about interprofessional obligations, back to Hippocratic considerations and other places in the world that have a long tradition of etiquette in relation to how medical practitioners relate to each other. That's sometimes a consideration when we think about medical ethics. So we might then think about clinical ethics, which at least allows other kind of specialties into the discussion, not just doctors. But the potential problem with clinical ethics, I think, is that a lot of the discussion over the last 50 years has been very individualistic. It's been very orientated towards the promotion of autonomy. And, I personally think, of course, autonomy is important. It is a relevant value, but it's not the only value. And I don't see any reason why we ought to promote that value in at least all cases above everything else. It will, in many cases, take priority, but not in relation to all of them.
About 2 minutes left, so maybe one last question. I'm just going to combine two questions that Murali and Serene have asked, and they seem quite related. So Murali believes that this idea that future people as a class have a claim on us seems quite ad hoc. And normally we take it that individuals as such have claims on us, and any class of people have claim on us if each individual in the class has a claim on us. However, future people can't criticize us for using the antibiotic today, because otherwise they wouldn't have been born. And contextually, I feel like Serene's question is quite relevant as well, because the notion of future people as seems like a monolithic block, but then they're not, because you would imagine that there is a difference between the next generation and the future people many generations removed. So maybe this could be our last, we could end on this note on future generations.
Yes, and again, there's a lot to say about this, and I think it's true that we owe a lot more to a generation or two into the future than we do into to those who may exist in 1,000 years. But I think the important thing is, do we really not think that future people are not important? Why do we have planning services for? Why do we provide healthcare for children who will be born next year? It's we think it's reasonable to take into account non-existent potential people, not as individuals, but we know that on average a certain number of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals will be born next year, but we don't know who they are. I think it's completely reasonable to plan on that basis for cohorts, not just for individuals. And we do that all the time, and we rightly do that all the time. So I think the issue is not future people versus presently existing people. It's how seriously do we take the claims of those in the future against us? And that's not something that I discussed here. That's another kind of talk. You know, what kinds of claims might a future individual have against presently existing individual? I didn't really say too much about what particular account of justice might be relevant here, and what the claims of justice might be in relation to those future people upon us. I didn't say anything about responsibility in this kind of context. So my focus here is trying to raise the question about what this might mean, what we might mean by the concept of sustainability, and how this might apply in the thinking through these issues in relation to just two examples for bioethics. In the objections, of course, one of the objections that I did discuss is non-identity, and you can agree or disagree with me, but I think if anybody believes that it's inappropriate to plan for the babies that will be born next year that don't presently exist, then I think that's a problem. So sorry, that's a kind of philosopher's response to that particular objection. But I think there is an insufficient practical acceptance of the idea that we do all have intuitions that future generations actually do matter. And that's why many people are thinking a lot about things like climate change, for example. So yeah, there's a lot to be said here, but sorry, that's my relatively quick answer on that particular question.
All right, thank you so much. I think we have gone just a little over time, but thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. Thank you, Prof. Dawson, for the very fascinating subject presentation. So thank you, everyone, for joining us in person and over Zoom. We will see you all again in the next edition of the CBME seminar in September, and we will be sending out the registration link and publication publicity materials soon enough. Thank you all.